Alright, story number 1, mitosis. So, if you want a refresher to what the process of mitosis actually is, I've put a link in the description to a Khan Academy textbook video thing about mitosis that will give you the particulars. And as I read this, I will point out some of the jargony words that he's referring to, but for the most part, I want the story to stand as what it is. So, let's begin. Mitosis. And when I say dying of love, Quoifiqua went on. Quoifiqua is our unreliable narrator. And when I say dying of love, Quoifiqua went on, I mean something you have no idea of, because you think falling in love has to signify falling in love with another person, or thing, or what have you. In other words, I'm here, and what I'm in love with is there, in a sort of relationship connected to the life of relationships, whereas I'm talking about the times before I had established any relationship between myself and anything else. There was a cell, and the cell was me, and that was that. Now, we needn't wonder whether there were other cells around too. It doesn't matter. There was the cell, and that was me, and it was already quite an achievement. Such a thing is more than enough to fill one's life. And it's this very sense of fullness I want to talk to you about. I don't mean fullness because of the protoplasm I had, because even if it had increased to a considerable degree, it wasn't anything exceptional. Cells are of course full of protoplasm. What else could they be full of? No, I'm talking about a sense of fullness that was, if you'll allow the expression, quote, spiritual, unquote. Namely, the awareness that this cell was me. This sense of fullness, this fullness of being aware, was something that kept me awake nights, something that made me besides myself. In other words, the situation I had mentioned before. I was dying of love. Now, I know you will all raise a flock of objections, because being in love presupposes not only a self-awareness, but also awareness of the other, etc., etc., and all I can answer is thanks a lot. I know that much myself, but if you aren't going to be patient, there's no use in trying to explain, and above all, you have to forget for a minute the way you fall in love nowadays, the way I, too, fall in love now. If you'll admit confidences of this sort, I say confidences because I know if I told you about my falling in love at present, you could accuse me of being indiscreet, whereas I can talk without any scruples about the time when I was a unicellular organism. That is, I can talk about it objectively, as the saying goes, because it's all water under the bridge now, and it's a feat on my part even to remember it. And yet, what I do remember is still enough to disturb me from head to foot. So, when I use the word objectively, it's a figure of speech, as it is always when you start out saying you're objective, and then with one thing and another you end up being subjective. This is an important thing, because, these textbooks, they're very objective, and what this story is about is trying to get into the subjective experience of what is it like to be a cell. So I'll read that again. So when I use the word objectively, it's a figure of speech, as it always is when you start out saying you're objective, and then with one thing or another you end up being subjective. And so this business I want to tell you about is difficult for me precisely because it keeps slipping into the subjective, into my subjective state of those days, which, though I recall it only partially, still disturbs me from head to foot, like my subjective of the present. And that's why I've used expressions that have the disadvantage of creating confusion with what is different nowadays, while they have the advantage of bringing into light what is common between the two times. Let's do that again. I've used expressions that have the disadvantage of creating confusion with what is different nowadays, while they have the advantage of bringing to light what is common between the two times. Right, so he's using a lot of anthropomorphic language that by definition humans can understand and relate to, and they're not going to apply to unicellular creatures, but they will in a way, and that way is enough to give us a vague idea. So it's not objective, it's not subjective, it is what it is. But, how else are we going to proceed than from our own experience? And so that's what he's doing. He's using human language to describe something very, very unhuman. First of all, I must be more specific about what little I remember, or rather, I should warn you that if certain parts of my story are narrated less fully than others, it doesn't mean they're less important, but that they are less firm in my memory, since what I remember well is my love story's initial phase, if you want to call it that. I would almost say the preceding phase. At the climax of the love story, my memory dissolves, frays, goes to pieces, and there's no way for me to remember then what happens afterwards. I say this not to ward off objections that I'm trying to make you listen to a love story that I don't remember, but to clarify the fact that not remembering it is at a certain point necessary to make this story this one and not another. In other words, while the story usually consists of the memory you have of it, here, not remembering the story becomes the very story itself. So this is the first time that he's bringing in this love-death theme, the Romeo-Juliet theme, that love and death, or in this case, being and forgetting, are inexorably intertwined, right? So he's talking about mitosis, and when he divides, at that point of division, he ceases to be. That was in the introduction, one of the things we read, that it's not really like a parent-offspring situation. Mitosis is once you've divided, there's two daughters, and the mother is gone. So, of course you can't remember it. You've ceased to be. So, I am speaking then of the initial phase of a love story, which afterwards is probably repeated in interminable multiplication of initial phases, just like the first and identified with the first. A multiplication, or rather, a squaring. An exponential growth of stories which is always tantamount to the first story. But it isn't as if I were so very sure of all this. I assume it as you can also assume it. I'm referring to an initial phase that precedes the other initial phases. A first phase which must surely have existed because it's logical to expect it to exist, and also because I remember it very well. And when I say it's the first, I don't in the least mean in the absolute sense. That's what you'd like me to mean. But I don't. I mean first in the sense that we can consider any of these identical phases the first. The one I refer to is the one I remember, and the one I remember as first in the let's go back. And when I say it's the first, I don't in the least mean first in the absolute sense. That's what you'd like me to mean, but I don't. I mean the first in the sense that we can consider any of these identical initial phases the first, and the one I refer to is the one I remember, and the one I remember as first in the sense that I don't remember that. The one I refer to is the one I remember, and the one I remember as first in the sense that before it, I don't remember anything. As for the first in the absolute sense, your guess is as good as mine. I'm not interested. So, what I stumbled over there is what he's trying to get at is this sort of myopic sense of being a cell, is you don't really have a sense of time, at least not in the sense of time that humans have, a sense of history, that, there was something way back in the beginning. No, like, you're the beginning, and you're the end. You're all that there is. You don't have experience outside of yourself, so of course you're the first, right? So he remembers the first thing that could possibly be remembered. Let's begin this way, then. There is a cell, and this cell is a unicellular organism, and this unicellular organism is me, and I know it, and I'm pleased about it. Nothing special so far. Now, let's try to represent this situation for ourselves in space and time. Time passes, and I, more and more pleased with being in it and with being me, am also more and more pleased that there is time, and that I am in time, or rather, that time passes, and I pass time, and time passes me, or rather, I am pleased to be contained in time, to be the content of time, or the container, in short, to mark by being me the passage of time. So that's a very interesting sense of time. Again, when you're a unicellular organism and you don't have memories, you don't have neurons to remember things, time is going to be experienced very different. The only way that you can measure time is, and this is true for us too, the only way that we can measure time is by experiencing changes to our physical body. And when your physical body is so simple, time is also going to be simple. That you and time are going to be harder to differentiate in a way. I am pleased to be contained in time, to be the content of time, or the container, in short, to mark by being me the passage of time. Now, you must admit that this begins to arouse a sense of expectation, a happy and hopeful waiting, a happy, youthful impatience, and anxiety. A youthful, excited anxiety, and also basically painful. A painful, unbearable tension and impatience. In addition, you must keep in mind that existing also means being in space. Let's go back. I shouldn't have read that sentence, so I'm going to read that whole thing again. Now, you must admit that this begins to arouse a sense of expectation. Because you're in time, right? There's time, there's a future, so you expect something. This begins to arouse a sense of expectation, a happy and hopeful waiting, a happy, youthful impatience, and also an anxiety. A youthful, excited anxiety, also basically painful. A painful, unbearable tension and impatience. So I love that transition, right? So you have, just from the axiom of time, you have the whole gamut of exciting and impatience and suffering, and this is that Buddhist thing, to desire is to suffer, right? And so to have a sense of past and future, by definition, implies suffering. So even unicellular cells suffer because they exist in time. In addition, you must keep in mind that existing also means being in space. And in fact, I was dished out into space to my full width, with space all around. And even though I had no knowledge, it obviously continued on all sides. There's no point in bothering now about what else this space contained. I was closed in myself and I minded my own business, and I didn't even have a nose, so I couldn't stick my nose out, or an eye to take an interest in outside, in what was and what wasn't. However, I had a sense of occupying space within space, of wallowing in it, of growing within my protoplasm in all various directions. But, as I said, I don't want to insist on this quantitative and material aspect. I want to talk above all about the satisfaction and the burning desire to do something with space, and to have time to extract enjoyment from space, and to have space to make something in the passing of time. Right, so this is another point about what it's like to be a cell. Right? We humans, we have external senses. We have eyes and ears and noses which give us information about the outside world beyond us. And unicellular creatures have senses like that too, but they're much more myopic. And so the space that the cell occupies is all that there is. And sure, there might be space around it, but that's not really relevant in the same way that it's relevant to humans. That like everything you are is the world. So there's this word Umwelt, which we'll return to, that captures this quite nicely, that every organism creates their own reality, which is constrained by the capacities of their bodies. So I'm going to read that last bit again. I want to talk above all about the satisfaction and the burning desire to do something with space, to have time to extract enjoyment from space, and to have space to make something in the passing of time. Up until now, I've kept time and space separated to help you understand me better, or rather, so that I could understand better what I should make you understand. But in those days, I didn't really distinguish too clearly what one of them was and what the other one was. There was me, in that point and in that moment, right? And then there was the outside, which seemed to me void. And then there was the outside, which seemed to me a void that I might occupy in another moment or point, in a series of other moments or points. In short, a potential projection of me where, however, I wasn't present, and therefore a void, which was actually the world and the future. But I didn't know that then. I didn't know that yet. I wanted to project myself into the world and the future, but I didn't know that they were world or future. It was just void. I didn't know that yet. It was void because perception was still denied me. And as for imagination, I was even further behind. And when it came to mental categories, I was at a total loss. But I had this contentment, because outside of me, there was this void that wasn't me, which perhaps would become me, because me was the only word that I knew. Me was the only word that I knew. As far for imagination, I was even further behind, and when it came to mental categories, I was at a total loss. But I had this contentment, because outside of me There was this void that wasn't me, which perhaps could become me because me was the only word I knew, and the only word I could have declined. A void that could become me, however, wasn't me at that moment, and basically never would be. It was the discovery of something else that wasn't, yet something... it was the discovery of something else that wasn't yet something, but anyhow wasn't me. Or rather, it wasn't me at that moment and in that point, and therefore was something else. And this discovery aroused an exhilarating enthusiasm in me. No, a torment, a dizzying torture, the dizziness of a void which represents everything possible. The complement of that fullness that was, for me, all. And there I was, brimming over with love for this elsewhere, this other time, this otherwise, silent and void. So this is what Carl Jung would call differentiation, right? So Quiffiqua is noting that there's a clear identification with self. There's self and there's other, and because he's denied perception, there's just him and then the void. There's nothing, and the excitement, the exuberance is recognizing in this distinction, and also in noting the distinction, realizing that the distinction could be transcended, that in the process of this cell being a cell, it might transcend the boundaries of the void and move into the void, become the void, extend himself into the beyond, right? This is the promise of life. And the way we talk about it now is in these spiritual terms, Jesus going up to heaven or reaching enlightenment or what have you. But that feeling, that sense of seeking the beyond had to have been with us in our earliest moments of life, in our earliest unicellular moments of life, because it's the defining feature of life, this definition of self and other, and a seeking to transcend that definition. That's what forces us, compels us to procreate and continue ourselves. I'm going to take a drink of water and let that point sink in. So you see, when I spoke of being in love, I wasn't saying something so far-fetched. And you were always on the point of interrupting me to say, in love with yourself. In love with yourself. And I was wise to pay you no attention and not use or let you use that expression. There, you see that being in love was even then the searing passion for what was outside me. It was the writhing of one who yearns to escape outside himself, as I then went rolling around in time and space, dying of love. For you see that being in love was even then the searing passion for what was outside me. And being in love was the searing passion for what was outside me. It was the writhing of one who yearns to escape outside himself, as I then went rolling around in time and space, dying of love. Why is Quiffiqua male? I don't know. Probably because Italo Calvino is male. But anyway, gender binaries. Let's transcend them, please. Can we please transcend them, please? To tell properly the way things proceeded, I must remind you of how I was made. Now we're going to get into cellular anatomy. A mass of protoplasm like a kind of pulpy dumpling with a nucleus in the middle. Now, I'm not just trying to make myself sound interesting, but I must say that in the nucleus I led a very intense life. Physically, I was an individual in his full flowering, all right. On this point, I feel like it would be indiscreet to insist. I was young, healthy, at the peak of my strength. But by that, I certainly don't want to deny that another, who might have been in worse shape, with his cytoplasm fragile or watery, could have revealed even greater talents. What's important to my story is how much this physical life of mine was reflected in the nucleus. I say physical not because there was a distinction between physical life and some other kind of life. That's really important. I say physical not because there was a distinction between physical life and some other kind of life, but to allow you to understand how physical life had, in the nucleus, its point of greatest concentration, sensitivity, and tension, so that while all around it I was perhaps calm and blissful in my whitish pulp, the nucleus shared in its cytoplasmic calm and bliss in its nucleic way, that is, accentuating and thickening the tangled grain and speckling that adorned it, so that I concealed in myself an intense nucleic labor, which then corresponded only to my exterior well-being, so that we might say the more I was happy to be me, the more my nucleus became charged with this thick impatience, and everything I was and everything I was gradually becoming ended up being nucleus, absorbed there and registered and accumulated in a serpentine twisting of spirals, in the gradually different way that they were forming a skein and unraveling. So I would say that everything I knew in the nucleus, if that wouldn't involve the danger of making you believe in a separate or perhaps even opposing function of the nucleus with respect to the rest. Whereas, if there's an agile or impulsive organism where you can't make out all these distinctions, that in the unicellular organism. That is the unicellular organism. Well, that was a mouthful. So what he's talking about is the dual reality of the nucleus and the cell, right? He's talking about mind-body distinction, and this is, I say physical life not because there was a distinction between physical life and some other kind of life, right? Like, we know the mind-body distinction is false. Like, everything we have is mind, and everything we have is body, and there isn't two kinds of substance, a mental substance and a physical substance. It's all one substance. And yet there's something unique about the substance where the mental is located, the brain for us, or the nucleus in the case of the cell, right? And what's unique about that is that everything that the cell is somewhat reflected in the center. It's reflected in the nucleus, in these, how does he put it? He puts it oh dear. The accentuating and thickening, the tangled grain and speckling that adorned it, right? So he's talking about DNA, and he's saying that everything in the whitish pulp is reflected and contained by, or sort of the pinnacle of it is represented in these speckled grains, these DNA fragments. So it's a way of talking about the mind-body distinction, which is very metaphorical, but perhaps a little bit more accurate. It's not that there's these two things. It's all the same thing, but the nucleus is a kind of condensed version of it all, if you will. So I would say that everything I knew in the nucleus. If that wouldn't involve the danger of making you believe in a separate, or perhaps even opposing function of the nucleus with respect to the rest, which of course there isn't. Whereas if there's an agile or impulsive organism where you can't make all these distinctions, that is the unicellular organism, right? You can't make a mind-body distinction in the unicellular organism because it's just one cell. But there is still specialization of parts, and the self is located in one part more intensely than in the rest. However, I don't want to exaggerate in the other direction either, as if to give you the idea of a chemical homogeneity, like an inorganic... I don't want to give you the idea of a chemical homogeneity, like an inorganic drop spilled there. You know better than I how many differentiations there are within the cell. Even within the nucleus, there's the endoplasmic reticulum, and the ribosomes, and the nuclear envelope, and all of these things. You know better than I how many differentiations there are within the cell, and even within the nucleus. And mine was in fact all speckled, freckled, dotted with filaments or strokes or lines, and each of these filaments or strokes or lines or chromosomes had a specific relationship to some of the characteristic of the cell that was me. Now, I might attempt a somewhat risky assertion and say that I was nothing but the sum of those filaments or lines or strokes, an assertion which can be disputed because of the fact that I was entirely I, and not a part of myself, but one that can also be sustained by explaining that the strokes were myself translated into strokes, and then to be retranslated back into me. And therefore, when I speak of the intense life of the nucleus, I don't mean so much the rustle or scraping of all of those lines inside the nucleus, as the nervousness of an individual who knows that he has all those lines, he is all those lines, but also knows there's something that can't be represented with those lines, a void of which those lines succeed only in feeling the emptiness. or rather the tension towards the outside, the elsewhere, the otherwise, which is what is then called a state of desire. So this is the paradox of representation, right? Let me go back to that. Now, I might attempt a somewhat risky assertion and say that I was nothing but the sum of those filaments or lines or strokes, an assertion which can be disputed because of the fact that I was entirely I and not a part of myself, but one that can also be sustained by explaining that those strokes were myself translated into strokes and then to be retranslated back into me. So this is representation, right? The nucleus represents him and is him in some complete sense, but it's just a bunch of strokes and lines. It's not the whole activity of the cell. So there's a double me here. There's me within me, right? This Ouroboros loop of the creature that contains itself, and it is entirely within itself, but it is not a part of itself. It's difficult to put this into good language, and this sort of convoluted language might actually be the best way to do it. But how can the representation of the thing be the entire thing? Well, it can't be, right? There's always something that can't be represented, some activity that can only be hinted at, right? And this is the void, right? And this is the defining characteristic of life is, seeking to define oneself, right? That's what those strokes or lines are. They're concretized self, physical self. But those strokes and lines, what they really do is they just point beyond. They say, these are the constraints that will allow you to move forward into this beyond land. I'm not sure if I'm putting this very right at all, but it's something that's very difficult to put into words, so all we can do is hint at it. I suppose that's the point. That's the point. I'm trying to say something that is unsayable, and so I can only poke around it with these little simple-y things. Yeah. All right, but let's continue on after that philosophical break. I hope I'm making sense. Am I making sense? Let me know if I'm making sense, please. The nervousness. Therefore, when I speak of the intense life of the nucleus, I don't mean such the rustle or scraping of all of those lines inside the nucleus as the nervousness of an individual who knows he has all those lines, he is all those lines, but also knows there's something that can't be represented with those lines, a void of which those lines succeed only in feeling the emptiness, or rather the tension towards the outside, the elsewhere, the otherwise, which is what is then called a state of desire. I had better be more precise about this state of desire business. A state of desire takes place when from a state of satisfaction, one passes into a state of mounting satisfaction, and immediately thereafter into a state of dissatisfying satisfaction, namely of desire. We're getting very Buddhist up in here. It isn't true that the state of desire takes place when something is missing. If something is missing, too bad, you do without it. And if something is indispensable, in doing without it, you do without some vital function, and therefore you proceed rapidly towards certain extinction. I mean that from a pure and simple state of lack, nothing can be born. Nothing good and nothing bad, only other lacks, including finally the lack of life, a condition notoriously neither good nor bad, right? So we're talking about normativity. Lacking implies a having, right? If there's just total lack, no good, no bad, it's just right? So that's the point that he's making here. I mean that from a pure and simple state of lack, nothing can be born. Nothing good and nothing bad. Only other lacks, including finally the lack of life. A condition notoriously neither good nor bad. But a state of lack pure and simple doesn't exist, as far as I know. In nature, the state of lack is experienced always in contrast with a previous state of satisfaction. And it is from this state of satisfaction that everything which can grow, grows. Things can only grow from a state of satisfaction, not from a state of lack. And it isn't true that the state of desire presupposes necessarily a desired something. The desired something begins to exist only when there is a state of desire, not because before that something wasn't desired, but because before, who knew it existed? So once there's the state of desire, it's precisely that something which begins to be. something which, if all goes well, will be the desired something, but which could also remain just something through lack of the desirer, who in desiring might also cease to be, as in the present case of dying of love, which we still don't know the end of. Then, to go back to the point where we were before, I must tell you that my state of desire tempted simply towards the elsewhere, another time, and otherwise that might contain something, or let's say, the world, or contain only me, or me in relation to something, or to the world, or something the world without me anymore. So there's a lot there about desire. I think I'm just gonna just let it sit there. I don't feel qualified to talk very much about the nature of desire and being, other than to say that they're intertwined. To make this point clear, I realize now I have gone back to talking in general terms, losing the ground gained with my previous clarifications. This often happens in love stories. Yes, he's gotten very convoluted. I was becoming aware of what was happening around me, through what was happening to the nucleus, and especially to the chromosomes of the nucleus. Through them, I gained an awareness of the void beyond me and beyond them, the fitful awareness that through them forced me to something, a state of desire which, however little we can move, becomes immediately a movement of desire. This movement of desire remained basically a desire for movement, as usually happens when you can't move towards some place because the world doesn't exist, or you don't know it exists. And in these cases, desire moves you to want to do something, or rather, to do anything. But when you can do nothing because of the lack of an outside world, the only thing you can allow yourself with scant means at your disposal is that special kind of doing which is saying. In short, I was moved to express my state of desire. My state motion desire of motion desire love moved me to say. And since the only thing I had to say was myself, I was moved to say myself, to express myself. I'll be more precise. Before, when I said that the very few means suffice for expressing, I wasn't telling the exact truth, and therefore I'll correct myself. For expressing, you need a language, and that's no trifle. As a language, all I had was those specks, or twigs, called chromosomes, and therefore all I had to do was repeat those specks, or twigs, and I was repeating myself. Obviously repeating myself insofar as language was concerned, which you will see is the first step towards repeating myself as such, which, as you see, also isn't repetition at all. But you'd better see that what you're going to see when the right time comes, because if I keep making clarifications within other clarifications, I'll never find my way out. Whew. Alright, so 2 points there. So one is that we are in interphase still. We are in the phase prior to mitosis where the DNA gets replicated, right? So that's where we're at. And so he's moved to express himself. And the best way he has for expressing himself is by repeating his DNA. And this gets back to this sort of self-other distinction and what it means to be a differentiated, individuated creature. It means to define yourself. And so he has this state of desire, this state of longing for the beyond, but the only thing that he can do, the only thing that all life can ever do in order to reach that beyond state is to go back to what you have, to go back to the beginning and define yourself. And so he does that by replicating his DNA. So where once there was one copy of adenine and guanine and cytosine and thymine, now there are two. Alright, I need another drink of water, and then we can move on. It's true that at this point we must proceed with great care to avoid falling into errors. All this situation I've tried to narrate, which at the beginning I defined as being in love, explaining then how this phrase must be understood, all this, in short, had repercussions inside the nucleus in a quantitative and energetic enrichment of the chromosomes. Indeed, their joyful doubling, because each of the chromosomes was repeated in a second chromosome. Speaking of the nucleus, I naturally tend to identify it with awareness, which is only a rather crude simplification. But even if things really were like that, it wouldn't imply awareness of possessing a double number of lines, because since each line had a function, each being, to return to the language metaphor, a word, the fact that one word was to be found twice didn't change what I was, since I consisted of an assortment of vocabulary of the different words or functions at my disposal, and the fact of having double words was felt in that sense of fullness, which I earlier called, quote, spiritual, unquote. And now you see how the quotation marks alluded to the fact that we are dealing with a basically quite material business of filaments, or lines, or twigs, though nonetheless joyful and energetic. So where is meaning found? You know, if I'm recording this video, right, so that it can be repeated endlessly. You can listen to it as many times as you want. So how is the meaning affected by repetition, right? The meaning doesn't change necessarily, you know? Like, it's the same story no matter how many times you listen to it. But there is something about repetition which creates new meaning where there wasn't meaning before. It's sort of like an orthogonal meaning. Like, the story means one thing, but by repeating and repeating and repeating, you're creating a new dimension in which meaning can be made. I think. We'll see. Anyway, his chromosomes are repeated, and he finds it, quote, spiritual, unquote. But it's all a very physical business, so it can't actually be spiritual, because spiritual implies immaterial, and nothing immaterial exists, so how can you be spiritual when there's nothing immaterial? This is the question. The question! Oh no, it's the question. So far I remember everything very well, because the memories of the nucleus, awareness or no awareness, retain a greater clarity. But this tension I was telling you about, as time went by, was transmitted into the cytoplasm. I was seized with a need to stretch to my full width, to a kind of intermittent stiffening of the nerves I didn't have, and so the cytoplasm had become more elongated, as if the two extremes wanted to run away from each other, in a bundle of fibrous matter which was all trembling no more and no less than the nucleus. In fact, it was now hard to distinguish between nucleus and cytoplasm. The nucleus had, so to speak, dissolved, and the little sticks were poised there halfway along this shaft of tense and fitful fibers, but without scattering, turning upon themselves all together like a merry-go-round. So now we've entered into prophase. So what happens in prophase? Well, the nuclear envelope dissolves, and the two centrioles migrate to opposite sides of the cell, and then they send out these fibers, these actin fibers, or these protein fibers, I don't know what protein is. They send out these fibers which attach to the chromosomes and prepare to pull them apart. So that's what happens in prophase, and that's what he's just described here in much more beautiful language than you'll ever find in a biology textbook, I promise you. To tell the truth, I had hardly noticed the explosion of the nucleus. I felt I was all myself in a more total way than ever before, and at the same time, I wasn't myself any longer. That all this me was a place where there was everything except me. What I mean is, I had the sense of being inhabited. No, of inhabiting myself. No, of inhabiting a me inhabited by others. No, I had a sense that another was inhabited by others. Instead, what I realized only then was the fact that of redoubling was the what I realized only then was the fact of redoubling, which before, as I said, I hadn't seen clearly. And then and there I found myself with an exorbitant number of chromosomes, all mixed together at the time because the pairs of twin chromosomes hadn't become unstuck, and I couldn't make head or tail of anything. In other words, faced by the mute unknown void into which I had gradually and amorously submerged myself, I had to say something that would re-establish my presence, but at that moment the words at my disposal seemed too many to me, too many to be arranged into something to say that was still me, my name, my new name. So this is very interesting, right? So we go back to interphase, where the DNA is being doubled, and the DNA is replicating, but it's all still me, it's all still Quiffiqua, it's just one individual creature. But then mitosis begins, and prophase starts, and the nuclear envelope dissolves, and he's realizing that he's becoming more than himself. And upon this realization, there's a kind of differentiation that occurs, and all of a sudden some of the chromosomes, which previously were him, are no longer him. they're another, right? Or to use his phrase, no, of inhabiting a me inhabited by others. No, I had the sense that another was inhabited by others. Instead, what I realized only then was the fact of redoubling, which before, as I said, I hadn't seen clearly, right? Before he just thought like, oh, it's double, but he's still the same me. What happens if you say yourself twice? You're still you, it's just twice you. But now, I realized only then the fact that redoubling, which before I hadn't seen clearly. Then and there I found myself with an exorbitant number of chromosomes, all mixed together at the time because the pair of twin chromosomes had become unstuck, and I couldn't make head or tail of anything. In other words, faced by the mute unknown void which I had gradually and amorously submerged myself, I had to say something that would re-establish my presence, but at that moment the words at my disposal seemed too many to me, too many to be arranged into something to say that was still me, my name, my new name. So a self-other distinction has been made, and some of the chromosomes are no longer me, even though they are you, and that's very, very overwhelming to feel inhabited by another creature. I remember another thing now. How, from this state of chaotic congestion, I tended to pass, in a vain search for relief, to a more balanced and neat congestion, to have a complete assortment of chromosomes arranged on one side and on one side and another on the other side. So the nucleus, or rather that whirligig of strokes that had taken the place of the exploded nucleus, at a certain point finally assumed a symmetrical, mirrored appearance, as if divaricating its strength to dominate the challenge of the silent unknown void, so that the redoubling which first concerned the individual twigs now involved the nucleus as a whole. Or rather, what I went on considering a sole nucleus and went on operating as such, though it was simply an eddy of stuff separating into two distinct eddies. So now he's talking about metaphase and anaphase, right? So in metaphase, all the chromosomes line up very symmetrically, and in anaphase they begin to separate. So this chaos of prophase, where everything is jumbled all together but beginning to differentiate, is reaching some sort of conclusion, where the nucleus actually begins to divide. Here, I must explain that this separation wasn't a matter of old chromosomes on one side and new chromosomes on the other, because if I haven't already told you, I'll tell you now, every twig, after thickening, had divided lengthwise, so that they were all equally old and equally new. This is important because before I used the verb to repeat, which as always was rather approximate, and might give the mistaken idea that there was an original twig and a copy, and also the verb to say, which was a bit out of place, although that expression about saying myself did work out fairly well. Out of place in that to say something you have to have someone who says and something that's said, and this wasn't actually the case at the time. So, this is one of the details of DNA replication, right? You have this double-stranded helix like this, and to replicate it, you unwind the helix, and then on either side, you add a new strand here, and you add a new strand here. So you've got two strands, and each one of those strands contains 50% old DNA, and then 50% new DNA. So neither one is new or old, they're both new, and they're both old. And so, that's what he's saying here. So here I must explain that this separation wasn't a matter of old chromosomes on one side and new chromosomes on the other, because if I haven't already told you, I'll tell you again, every twig after thickening divided lengthwise, so that they were all equally old and equally new. This is important because I used the verb to repeat before, which as always was a rather approximate and might give you the mistaken idea that there was an original twig and a copy, and also the verb to say, which was a bit out of place, although that expression about saying myself worked out fairly well. Out of place in that to say something, you have to have someone who says and something that's said, and that wasn't actually the case at the time, right? So it's not that, like, he's producing a new child. He's becoming two children. Right, it's a fine distinction that we don't normally think of, because in the human example, the mother gives birth to the child, but she continues being the mother. It's difficult, in other words, to define in precise terms the imprecision of amorous moods, which consist in a joyous impatience to possess a void, in a greedy expectation of what might come to me from the void, and also in the pain of being still deprived of what I am impatiently and greedily expecting, in the tormenting pain of feeling myself already potentially doubled to possess potentially something potentially mine, and yet forced not to possess, to consider not mine, and therefore potentially another's, what I potentially possess. The pain of having to bear the fact that the potentially mine is also potentially another's, or, for all I know, actually another's. This greedy, jealous pain is a state of such fullness that it makes you believe being in love consists entirely and only in pain, and the greedy impatience is nothing but jealous desperation, and the emotion of impatience is only the emotion of despair that twists within itself, becoming more and more desperate, with the capacity that each particle of despair has for redoubling and arranging itself symmetrically alongside the analogous particle, and for tending to move from its own state to enter another, perhaps worse state, which rends and lacerates the former. This is the pain of differentiation. In this tug of war between the two eddies, an interval was being formed, and this was the moment when my state of doubling began to be clear to me, first as a branching of awareness, as a kind of squinting of the sense of presence of all, as a kind of squinting of the sense of presence of all of me, because it wasn't only the nucleus which was affected by these phenomena. As you already know, everything going on in those little sticks of the nucleus was reflected in what was happening in the extension of my tapering physical person, commanded in fact by those sticks. So my cytoplasm fibers were becoming concentrated in two opposing directions and were growing thin in the middle until the moment came when I seemed to have two equal bodies, one on one side and one on the other, joined by a bottleneck that was becoming finer and finer until it was only a thread. Right? This is cytokinesis now. And at that instant, I was for the first time aware of plurality. For the first and last time, because it was late by then, I felt the plurality in me as the image and destiny of the world's plurality, and the sense of being part of the world, of being lost in the innumerable world, and at the same time the still sharp sense of being me. I say sense, and no longer awareness, because if we agreed to call awareness what I felt in the nucleus, then the nuclei were two, and each was tearing at the last fibers that kept it bound to the other, and by now they were both transmitting on their own and on my own now, on my own in a repeated fashion, each independent awareness as if stammering ripped away the last fibers of my memories, right? So the two independent nuclei become independent selves which are no longer him, and all that he is that last shred of cytoplasm in the very center of that cytokinetic rift. And in that rift, he's experiencing transcendence. He's experiencing being one with everything, right? Because that's what being nothing is, being one with everything. And these two awarenesses go on, and all he has is can sense this rift of being ripped out into all of the universe and becoming that universe. This is death, but it's also new life. There's two new selves going on where he has ended. I say that the sense of being me no longer came from the nuclei, but out of that bit of plasma strangled and wrung out there in the middle. And it was still like a filiform zenith of fullness, like a delirium where I saw all the diversities of the plural world filiformly radiating from my former singular continuity. And at that same moment I realized that my moving out of myself was an exit with no return, without possible restitution of the me that now I realize I'm throwing away, without its possible restitution to me ever. And then comes the death agony that precipitates triumphantly because life is already elsewhere, already the flashes of another's memory, of another cell which are split, not superimposed. Establish the relationship of the novice cell, the relationship with the novice cell and with the rest. Everything that came afterwards is lost in the memory, shattered and multiplied like the propagation and repetition of the world of unremembering and mortal individuals. But already an instant before that afterwards began, I understood everything that was about to happen. The future, or the soldering of the link that now or already then happens or tended to desperately to happen. I understood that this picking up and moving out of oneself, which is the birth-death, would make the circuit, would be transformed from strangling and fracture into interpenetration and mingling of asymmetrical cells that add up messages repeated through trillions of mortal loves. I saw my mortal love return to seeking the original soldering, or the final one, and that all the words that weren't exact in the narration of my love story became exact, and yet their meaning remained the exact meaning of before. And the love kindled in the forest of the plurality of the sexes, and of the individuals and of the species, the empty dizziness filled with the form of the species and individuals of the sexes, and yet there was always the repetition of that wrench of myself, of that picking up and moving out of myself, the yearning towards the impossible doing which leads to saying, the impossible saying which leads to expressing oneself. And even when the self will be divided into a self that says and will surely die. So at this point we're talking about meiosis and multicellular life. If you didn't, we're going to get to that later. This is a preamble, a very, very long sentence. The last 2 pages of this document are 1 sentence. So forgive yourself if you're a bit confused. I'm a bit confused too, but this is what is happening, is there's everything being compressed into this tiny, tiny moment of death and plurality and transcendence. And of course it can just be 1 sentence where everything's going on all over the place, because how else do you express something like that? And yet there was always the repetition of the wrench of myself, of that picking up and moving out of myself. The yearning towards that impossible doing which leads to saying. The impossible saying which leads to expressing oneself, even when the self will be divided into a self that says and will surely die, and a self that is said and at times risks living on. In a multicellular and unique self that retains its cells, the one that, repeating itself, repeats the secret words of the vocabulary that we are, and in a unicellular and countlessly plural unicellular self which can be poured out into countless cell words, of which only the one that encounters the complementary cell word, that is the asymmetrical self, will try to continue the continuous and fragmentary story. So now he's talking about fertilization between egg and sperm. But if it doesn't encounter it, no matter. In fact, in the story which I'm about to tell, there was no plan for the encounter at all. Indeed, at the beginning, we'll try to avoid its taking place, because what matters is the initial, or rather preceding phase, which repeats every initial, or rather preceding phase. The encounter with oneself, loving and mortal, in the best of cases loving, and in any case mortal. What matters is the moment when, wrenching yourself from yourself, you feel in a flash of union the past and the future, just as I, in the wrenching from myself, which I have just now finished narrating to you, saw what was to happen. Finding myself today in love, in a today, perhaps in the future, perhaps in the past, but also surely contemporaneous with that last unicellular and self-contained instant, I saw who was coming forward towards me from the void of the elsewhere, the other time, the otherwise, with the first and last name, address, red coat, little black boots, fringe, freckles, Priscilla language, chez Madame Le Bras, Saint-Quatre, Vignette, Trézy, Verugard, Paris, Queseme. So that ends story number 1, mitosis, and that concluding bit was a bit confusing, right? So we got to the point where the cells finally separate, and he's experiencing the infinite, and he sees forward into the future when multicellular evolution has occurred and sex has become instantiated into what it means to be alive, and this moment of fertilization, which is the inverse of mitosis, right? Where instead of 2 cells, which were formerly 1, dividing and making 2, now you have 2 cells, which were formerly 2, combining and making 1. And that's fertilization. So the inverse transcendent moment, if you will, becoming beyond yourself by merging with another. And that is what we will read about in the next chapter, meiosis. So thank you for joining me in reading these stories. I hope you are enjoying them. Again, if you want some more technical biological understanding of what's going on, you can check a link in the description, and I have a full video lecture by Khan Academy linked there that will give you the details of what's actually happening in mitosis on a cellular level. But I don't think that kind of thing can be understood unless you understood it on this sort of emotional, transcendent level, because that's what's happening. That's what's happening every single moment of all the time. You know, you've got trillions of cells, and every one of them is dividing like this, and it's important to try to remember how the infinite is buried into every single moment of our life, and you know, that having a technical scientific understanding of the process can only take you so far. Sometimes you need to be a little bit more creative and try to imagine what it's really like to be there, be at those rifts between the two cells, to understand the enormity of what's going on, and what is going on constantly and perpetually in the world. So that's mitosis. Thanks. I'll see you next time.